You wake up one morning and you realize you don't want anything anymore. The goals that used to make you jump out of bed now feel empty. That promotion at work, the bigger house, the endless chase for social validation, all that stuff that seems so important now just feel irrelevant. And the really scary part is, you can't tell if you're experiencing some kind of spiritual awakening or if you're just in a serious existential funk. Eckhart Tolle has an answer that might just shock you, and it explains why the more spiritually awake you become, the less motivation you seem to feel. But hold on, because what looks like the end of the road might actually be the start of something you can't even imagine yet. Let me tell you what happened to Eckhart Tolle when he was 29. He was lying in bed in London, suffering from a depression so intense he could barely breathe. One night a thought popped into his head: I can't stand living with myself anymore. And that's when something extraordinary happened. Tolle realized there were two I's in that sentence: the I who couldn't stand it anymore, and the I he couldn't live with. In that moment, a separation occurred. Consciousness detached from the ego, and everything he knew as motivation, as purpose, as meaning, just vanished. But here's the paradox that nobody tells you. In the following months, Tolle just sat on park benches, doing nothing, wanting nothing, planning nothing. To any outside observer, he looked like a broken man. No job, no relationships, no ambition. But internally, something completely different was happening. He was experiencing a peace so profound that no external achievement had ever provided. And that's the first thing you need to understand. What looks like death on the outside can be a rebirth on the inside. Ever wonder why the most accomplished people in the world still seem so unsatisfied? Billionaires who have everything and still want more. Celebrities at the peak of fame falling into depression. Athletes winning gold medals and feeling empty on the podium. Neuroscience has an explanation for this. Researchers at Harvard University discovered that the brain's reward system works on anticipation, not realization. What does that mean? It means that dopamine, the neurotransmitter of motivation, is released primarily when you're chasing something, not when you get it. The pleasure is in the hunt, not the kill. Now think about what happens when you spiritually awaken. You start to see through the illusion. You realize the hunt never ends, that each achievement just opens the door to the next desire, that the system is designed to never satisfy you. And when you see that clearly, something inside of you just stops participating in the game, not out of laziness, not out of depression, but out of clarity. And that clarity is often mistaken for a lack of motivation. Carl Jung called this the nigredo stage, the stage of darkness, of decomposition, of symbolic death. In spiritual alchemy, it's the first and most painful phase of transformation. Jung explained that in this phase, motivation based on ego and social approval simply dissolves. This isn't regression, it's a psychic threshold, the chrysalis stage. And just as the caterpillar needs to completely dissolve before it becomes a butterfly, you need to lose who you thought you were before you discover who you really are. But here's where most people get lost, and where you might be getting lost right now. Society has no space for this phase. Your friends will ask you what's wrong. Your family will worry. Your therapist might even diagnose you with depression. And you yourself might believe that something is broken in you, that you need fixing, that you need to go back to being how you were before, motivated, ambitious, productive. Tolle warns that this is the most dangerous moment. Because if you try to force the motivation back, you abort the transformation process. It's like ripping the butterfly out of the cocoon before it's ready. It'll come out, but its wings won't work. It'll live, but it'll never fly. And that's what happens to people who interrupt the nigredo stage. They go back to functioning, but something essential dies inside of them. The possibility of a truly authentic life. There's a crucial difference you need to understand right now. The difference between clinical depression and the dark night of the soul. In clinical depression, there's a chemical dysfunction. The brain isn't producing the right neurotransmitters. The person feels pain but sees no meaning in it. There's no transformation happening, just suffering. But in the dark night of the soul, something completely different is at play. Yes, there's suffering. Yes, there's a loss of motivation. But there's also a subtle feeling that something bigger is happening. An intuition that this is necessary, even if you don't understand why. Tolle describes the dark night of the soul as a death. But a death of what? Of the egoic sense of self, of the character you've built over a lifetime, of the masks you wear to get approval, of the beliefs about who you should be, of the goals that other people planted in you, of the compulsive need to prove your worth. All of that dies. And of course, it's painful. After all, you've spent your whole life building that identity. But what dies isn't you. It's the illusion of you. Researchers in contemplative neuroscience have discovered something fascinating about seasoned meditators and people who report experiences of ego dissolution. Studies published in scientific journals like Frontiers in Neuroscience show that during these experiences, the activity in the brain's default mode network decreases significantly. The default mode network is the area responsible for self-referential thinking. It's the part of the brain that keeps repeating stories about who you are, what you've done, what others think of you. When that network silences, the sense of separate self temporarily dissolves. And here's the direct connection with motivation. The default mode network is also closely linked to motivation based on social comparison and self-aggrandizement. When you want something to look better than others, to prove your worth, to validate your existence, that network is active. But when it silences through deep meditation or spontaneous awakening, all that ego-driven motivation simply disappears. Not because something is wrong, but because you're accessing a completely different way of existing. Now comes the question that's probably on your mind. If I lose ego-driven motivation, how am I going to function in the world? How am I going to pay my bills? How am I going to take care of my family? How am I going to accomplish anything? That's a legitimate concern, and Tolle addresses it directly. He explains that there's a fundamental difference between ego-driven motivation and presence-driven motivation. All right, so ego-driven motivation, it comes from fear, from a feeling of lack, from this burning need to prove something. It's compulsive, it's anxious, and it's never satisfied. Presence-driven motivation, though, that springs from a completely different place. It bubbles up naturally when you're present in the moment. It's not fueled by need, but by alignment, by joy, by this unshakable feeling that this is what needs to be done right now. Let me give you a concrete example. Someone with ego-driven motivation might grind 16 hours a day, just to get rich, to prove their worth. They wake up with anxiety gnawing at them. They work under constant stress. And even when they do get richer, it never feels like enough because the source of their motivation is this bottomless pit inside, a pit that external achievements can never fill. Now picture someone with presence-driven motivation. They wake up and they just know what needs to be done today, not out of anxiety, but from crystal clear clarity. They work with focus, but without the compulsive stress. They do what they do because that's what's flowing through them. And when the day is done, they're done. No need for more, you see the difference? The first person is constantly chasing. The second is constantly present. The first never arrives. The second is already where they need to be. The first is at war with themselves. The second is at peace with life. And when you spiritually awaken, that shift from one to the other can feel like a loss of motivation. But really, it's just the death of an unhealthy form of motivation, making way for something healthy. Eckhart Tolle tells this interesting story about his early years after his awakening. People started coming to him, asking for advice. At first, it was just a few people, then dozens, and then hundreds. He never planned to become a spiritual teacher. He didn't craft some elaborate career strategy. He never dreamed of writing bestsellers. It all just happened. People showed up, and he spoke. Publishers reached out, and he wrote. Invitations arrived, and he went. No ambition, no 5-year plan. Just responding to what life presented. That's what Eckhart Tolle calls awakened action. Action that comes from presence, not the ego. Action that responds to life instead of trying to control it. Action that flows instead of forcing. And this kind of action can be incredibly productive. More productive, actually, than ego-driven action, because there's no energy wasted on anxiety, comparison, or self-criticism. All the energy goes straight into what needs to be done. But how do you make that transition? How do you break free from ego-driven motivation without getting paralyzed? That's the practical question you're probably dying to have answered. So, here are 5 concrete steps that Eckhart Tolle and other spiritual masters recommend. First, you have to accept the phase you're in. If you've lost motivation after a spiritual awakening, don't fight it. Don't try to force productivity. Don't compare yourself to who you were before. That comparison is just the ego trying to rebuild itself. Allow yourself to be in that phase of emptiness. It's temporary, even if it doesn't feel like it. Eckhart Tolle spent 2 years sitting on park benches. 2 years. And he emerged as one of the most influential spiritual teachers in the world. That phase of apparent inaction might be the most important phase of your transformation. Second, notice the difference between doing and being. The ego only knows doing. It needs constant action to feel real. But consciousness can simply be. And in that being, paradoxically, the right action emerges naturally. Eckhart Tolle recommends starting each day with a few minutes of simple presence, not doing anything, not planning, not thinking about what needs to be done, just being. And from there, let the action arise. Don't force it, don't plan it, just allow it. Third, trust the process. This is maybe the hardest one. When everyone around you is hustling, competing, achieving, standing still can feel irresponsible. But remember, the caterpillar also looks dead before it becomes a butterfly. The cocoon seems useless, but inside, an impossible transformation is happening, and you can't speed it up. You can only trust, you can only allow. Fourth, pay attention to the subtle signals. Even in the deepest phase of emptiness, little impulses of action can arise. Not impulses from the ego, which come with anxiety and urgency, but impulses from presence, which come with clarity and peace. It could be something simple, a sudden urge to take a walk, to call someone, to write something. When those impulses surface, follow them, without questioning, without analyzing. This is the new form of motivation learning to manifest through you. Fifth, take care of your body. Eckhart Tolle emphasizes that spiritual awakening doesn't mean neglecting your physical well-being. During this transformation phase, the body goes through profound changes. Adequate sleep, healthy food, gentle movement. These things aren't spiritual in the traditional sense, but they're essential for the transformation process to complete healthily. A lot of people in the awakening phase neglect their bodies, and that can unnecessarily prolong the transition period. A study published in the scientific journal Communication Psychology by Nature in 2025 revealed something important about what they called spiritual boredom. They found that this state occurs at significant levels in practitioners, being caused by feeling over or under challenged and perceiving little meaning in the practice, and that this spiritual boredom is associated with a reduction in motivation for the practice. In other words, science is starting to validate what mystics have always known. There's a phase of emptiness, of loss of meaning. That's part of the path. It's not a bug, it's a feature. Now I need to talk about something delicate. Some people use spirituality as an excuse to avoid responsibilities. They say they've lost motivation because they've awakened, but they're really just running away from life. So how do you tell the difference? The person genuinely in transformation feels peace in the emptiness. The person running away feels anxiety, guilt, or numbness. The first is present in the now. The second is lost in mental justifications. The first accepts their situation. The second resists it while pretending to accept it. If you're reading this and feeling discomfort, that could be an important sign. Honestly examine whether you're in transformation or in flight. There's another phenomenon that Eckhart Tolle describes that few spiritual teachers even mention. He calls it integration. After the initial awakening, after the phase of emptiness, comes a period where the new consciousness needs to integrate with practical life. And in that period, curiously, motivation can return. But a completely different kind of motivation, not driven by lack, not driven by fear, not driven by the need to prove something, driven by alignment with something larger, by service, by genuine contribution. And this motivation, unlike the old one, doesn't exhaust you. All right, so she empowers. Eckhart Tolle says that in the early years after his awakening, he had zero interest in teaching, no spiritual ambition whatsoever, but people started coming to him. And something within him responded, not an I that wanted to be a teacher, but a presence that naturally shared when asked. And gradually, over years, this morphed into the work we know today. Millions of books sold, millions of lives touched, all without a business plan, all without ambition in the traditional sense, all as a natural response from presence to circumstance. The super thanks button right below is a way to support this content and declare to the universe that you value this knowledge. Few channels tackle this topic with this depth because it's misunderstood even by spiritual teachers. Here you won't find empty platitudes about positive thinking. You'll find the truth about a phase that many go through in silence, thinking they're broken. When you support, you're not just paying for a video. You're participating in a mission to make this knowledge accessible to those who need to hear it. Tolle talks about a state he calls creative flow, and it's different from motivation as we normally understand it. It doesn't come from wanting something. It doesn't come from needing to prove anything. It comes from a connection with the deeper intelligence of life. And this state, according to Tolle, only becomes accessible after ego-driven motivation dies. While the ego is in command, it blocks this flow with its plans, its anxieties, its compulsive needs. When it gets out of the way, the flow starts naturally. Have you ever had moments where work flowed effortlessly? Moments where hours flew by and you didn't even notice? Moments where ideas came faster than you could capture them? That's a glimpse of what Tolle describes. But for most people, these moments are rare and unpredictable. For those who have gone through ego death and come out the other side, they become the normal state, not through effort, but through the absence of obstruction. There's something that Tolle calls inner purpose and outer purpose. Outer purpose is what you do in the world, your profession, your projects, your achievements. Inner purpose is being present while doing anything. And here's the crucial revelation. When you awaken, inner purpose becomes primary. Outer purpose becomes secondary. You can still have goals, still achieve things, but they no longer define who you are. They're expressions of presence, not substitutes for it. This explains why the old motivation dies. The old motivation was based on outer purpose. I need to achieve this to feel complete. I need to prove this to have value. I need to accomplish this to be happy. When you awaken, you realize that you're already complete, that you already have intrinsic value, that happiness doesn't depend on achievements, and that whole motivational structure simply collapses, not because something is wrong, but because the foundation of it was an illusion that you now see clearly. The good news is that a new structure can emerge, a structure based on inner purpose. And when that happens, external action can return, but in a completely different way, not compulsive, not anxious, not never satisfied, but calm, present, and paradoxically, much more effective. Remember when I mentioned the default mode network of the brain? Researchers have discovered that when this network quiets down through deep meditation, other areas of the brain become more active, particularly areas associated with creativity, insight, and problem solving. In other words, when the narrative I stops talking, deeper parts of the brain can finally be heard. And from these deeper parts comes a form of intelligence that the ego could never access. Tolle says that the thinking mind is a wonderful tool when used correctly, but most people don't use the mind. The mind uses them. It functions compulsively, generating thoughts non-stop, creating problems that don't exist, imagining futures that will never come. When you awaken, you stop being used by the mind and can start to use it as a tool when needed and turn it off when it's not. There's a phenomenon that many people experience during the phase of lost motivation that's rarely discussed. It's what some call spiritual imposter syndrome. You start to question whether your awakening was real. If you're not just using spirituality as an excuse for laziness, if everyone around you can function and you can't, maybe the problem is you. Tolle addresses this directly. He says that these questions are the ego trying to rebuild itself. The ego doesn't die easily. It uses any strategy to get back in command, including convincing you that you're not really awakening. Another important aspect that Tolle mentions is the relationship between awakening and relationships. When you lose ego-driven motivation, your relationships change. The people around you may not understand what's happening. They may feel that you've changed, that you're not the same person, and in a certain sense, they're right. You're not the same person. The mask you use to interact with them is dissolving. And that can be uncomfortable for everyone. Tolle recommends having compassion for yourself and for others during this phase. The people around you are reacting from their own limitations. They can't see what you're going through because they've probably never gone through anything similar. Don't expect them to understand. Just allow them to react as they will, without trying to convince them, without trying to explain yourself, just being. There's also the practical question of sustenance. If you've lost the motivation to work, how are you going to pay your bills? Tolle doesn't deny the practical reality. He recognizes that we live in a world that requires action, that requires economic participation. His recommendation is interesting. Do the minimum necessary to sustain yourself while the transformation happens. Don't force yourself into ambitious goals. Don't try to keep up the previous pace, but also don't completely neglect basic needs. Find a balance that allows the process to continue without creating unnecessary crises. And here's something that few talk about. The phase of lost motivation can last much longer than you expect. For some, it's months. For others, years. Tolle spent about 2 years in a state of apparent inactivity, 2 years sitting on park benches, sleeping on friends' couches or in shelters, with no plan, no ambition. And from him came one of the most influential spiritual teachings of our time. I'm not saying you need to replicate that. I'm saying there's no defined timeline. All right, so everyone has their own rhythm, their own pace of transformation, their own timeline. Eckhart Tolle often uses this metaphor. Imagine a glass of muddy water, with sediment all stirred up at the bottom. If you shake that glass, the water gets cloudy. You can't see through it at all. But if you stop shaking it and just let it sit, that sediment gradually settles, the water clears, and you can see through it perfectly. It's the same with the mind. As long as you're constantly doing, constantly chasing, the mind stays agitated. The sediment of your thoughts never settles. Clarity never emerges. But when you pause, when you allow that phase of apparent inactivity, that's when the sediment starts to go down. The water clears, and a way of seeing that was always there but obscured finally reveals itself. That clarity, that's what Eckhart Tolle calls presence. And it's from that presence that a new kind of motivation emerges. Not a forced motivation, not some ego-driven motivation based on lack, but a motivation that is the natural expression of who you really are. And that can only happen after the sediment has settled, after the water has cleared, after that phase of apparent inaction has fulfilled its purpose. So here's the truth you need to carry with you. That loss of motivation after spiritual awakening isn't a problem to be solved. It's a portal to be crossed. It's not the end of your productivity. It's the end of a toxic form of productivity. It's not the death of you. It's the death of who you never were. And on the other side of that portal awaits a way of living you can't even imagine yet, a way where doing and being aren't in conflict, where action and peace coexist, where motivation and presence are the same thing. So, the question I'm leaving you with is this. Are you willing to let die the version of yourself that needs external validation and ego-driven motivation to feel alive? Or are you going to spend your life trying to resuscitate a corpse? Comment ego death if you're going through this phase right now. Comment rebirth if you've already come out on the other side. And if you know someone who's lost their motivation and thinks they're broken, send them this video. It might be exactly what they need to hear and to understand that they're not dying. They're finally starting to live.